The Symphony No. 5 in C minor of Ludwig van Beethoven, Op. 67, was written 1804–1808. It is one of the best-known compositions in classical music, and one of the most frequently played symphonies. First performed in Vienna's Theatre an der Wien in 1808, the work achieved its prodigious reputation soon afterward. E.T.A. Hoffmann described the symphony as one of the most important works of the time. It begins by stating a distinctive four-note short-long motif twice. The symphony, and the four-note opening motif in particular, are known worldwide, with the motif appearing frequently in popular culture, from disco to rock and roll, to appearances in film and television. Since the Second World War it has sometimes been referred to as the Victory Symphony. V is the Roman character for the number 5. The phrase V for victory became well known as a campaign of the Allies of World War II. That Beethoven's Victory Symphony happened to be his fifth is coincidence. Some 30 years after this piece was written, the rhythm of the opening phrase Euro dit 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 Dao Euro was used for the letter V in Morse code, though this is probably also coincidental. The BBC, during World War II, prefaced its broadcasts to Europe with those four notes, played on drums. History, development. The Fifth Symphony had a long gestation. The first sketches date from 1804 following the completion of the Third Symphony. However, Beethoven repeatedly interrupted his work on the Fifth to prepare other compositions, including the first version of Fidelio, the Appassionata Piano Sonata, the three Razumovsky string quartets, the violin concerto, the fourth piano concerto, the Fourth Symphony, and the Mass in C. The final preparation of the Fifth Symphony, which took place in 1807–1808, was carried out in parallel with the Sixth Symphony, which premiered at the same concert. Beethoven was in his mid-30s during this time. His personal life was troubled by increasing deafness. In the world at large, the period was marked by the Napoleonic Wars, political turmoil in Austria, and the occupation of Vienna by Napoleon's troops in 1805. Premiere: The Fifth Symphony was premiered on December 22, 1808 at a mammoth concert at the Theatre an der Wien in Vienna consisting entirely of Beethoven premieres, and directed by Beethoven himself. The concert lasted for more than 4 hours. The two symphonies appeared on the program in reverse order, the sixth was played first, and the fifth appeared in the second half. The program was as follows: the Sixth Symphony, aria, R, Perfido, Op. 65, the Gloria movement of the Mass in C major, the Fourth Piano Concerto, intermission, the Fifth Symphony, the Sanctus and Benedictus movements of the C major Mass, a solo piano improvisation played by Beethoven, the Choral Fantasy. Beethoven dedicated the Fifth Symphony to two of his patrons, Prince Franz Joseph von Lobkowitz and Count Razumovsky. The dedication appeared in the first printed edition of April 1809. Reception and influence: there was little critical response to the premiere performance, which took place under adverse conditions. The orchestra did not play well with only one rehearsal before the concerto, and at one point, following a mistake by one of the performers in the choral fantasy, Beethoven had to stop the music and start again. The auditorium was extremely cold and the audience was exhausted by the length of the program. However, a year and a half later, publication of the score resulted in a rapturous unsigned review in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. He described the music with dramatic imagery. Radiant beams shoot through this region's deep night, and we become aware of gigantic shadows which, rocking back and forth, close in on us and destroy everything within us except the pain of endless longing, a longing in which every pleasure that rose up in jubilant tones sinks and succumbs, and only through this pain, which, while consuming but not destroying love, hope, and joy, tries to burst our breasts with full-voiced harmonies of all the passions, we live on and are captivated beholders of the spirits. Apart from the extravagant praise, Hoffmann devoted far the largest part of his review to a detailed analysis of the symphony, in order to show his readers the devices Beethoven used to arouse particular effects in the listener. In an essay titled Beethoven's Instrumental Music, compiled from this 1810 review and another one from 1813 on the Op. 70-string trios, published in 3 installments in December 1813. E.T.A. Hoffmann further praised the indescribably profound, magnificent symphony in C minor. How this wonderful composition, in a climax that climbs on and on, leads the listener imperiously forward into the spirit world of the infinite. No doubt the whole rush is like an ingenious rhapsody past many a man, but the soul of each thoughtful listener is assuredly stirred, deeply and intimately, by a feeling that is none other than that unutterable portentous longing, and until the final chord indeed, even in the moments that follow each he will be powerless to step out of that wondrous spirit realm where grief and joy embrace him in the form of sound. The symphony soon acquired its status as a central item in the repertoire. It was played in the inaugural concerts of the New York Philharmonic on December 7, 1842, and the U.S. National Symphony Orchestra on November 2, 1931. It was first recorded by the Odeon Orchestra under Friedrich Karg in 1910. The first movement was featured on the Voyager Golden Record, a phonograph record containing a broad sample of the images, common sounds, languages, and music of Earth, sent into outer space with the 2 Voyager probes. Groundbreaking in terms of both its technical and its emotional impact, the fifth has had a large influence on composers and music critics, and inspired work by such composers as Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Bruckner, Mahler, and Berlioz. Instrumentation: the symphony is scored for piccolo, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets in B-flat and C, 2 bassoons, contrabassoon or double bassoon, 2 horns in E-flat and C, 2 trumpets, 3 trombones, timpani and strings. Form: a typical performance usually lasts around 30–40 minutes. The work is in 4 movements. First movement, Allegro con brio. The first movement opens with a 4-note motif discussed above, one of the most famous in Western music. There is considerable debate among conductors as to the manner of playing the 4 opening bars. Some conductors take it in strict allegro tempo. Others take the liberty of a weighty treatment, playing the motif in a much slower and more stately tempo. Yet others take the motif molto ritardando, arguing that the fermata over the 4th note justifies this. Some critics and musicians consider it crucial to convey the spirit of pause and 2 and 1, as written, and consider the more common 1-2-3-4 to be misleading. To wit, about the ta-ta-ta-ta Beethoven begins with 8 notes. They rhyme, 4 plus 4, and each group of 4 consists of 3 quick notes plus 1 that is lower and much longer. The space between the 2 rhyming groups is minimal, about 1/7 of a second if we go by Beethoven's metronome mark. Moreover, Beethoven clarifies the shape by lengthening the second of the long notes. This lengthening, which was an afterthought, is tantamount to writing a stronger punctuation mark. As the music progresses, we can hear in the melody of the second theme, for example, that the constantly invoked connection between the 2 4-note units is crucial to the movement. The source of Beethoven's unparalleled energy here is in his writing long sentences and broad paragraphs whose surfaces are articulated with exciting activity. Indeed, we discover soon enough that the double ta-ta-ta-ta is an open-ended beginning, not a closed and self-sufficient unit. What makes this opening so dramatic is the violence of the contrast between the urgency in the 8th notes and the ominous freezing of motion in the unmeasured long notes. The music starts with a wild outburst of energy but immediately crashes into a wall. Seconds later, Beethoven jolts us with another such sudden halt. The music draws up to a half cadence on a G major chord, short and crisp in the whole orchestra, except for the first violins, who hang on to their high C for an unmeasured length of time. Forward motion resumes with a relentless pounding of 8th notes. The first movement is in the traditional sonata form that Beethoven inherited from his classical predecessors, Haydn and Mozart. It starts out with 2 dramatic fortissimo phrases, the famous motif, commanding the listener's attention. Following the first 4 bars, Beethoven uses imitations and sequences to expand the theme, these pithy imitations tumbling over each other with such rhythmic regularity that they appear to form a single, flowing melody. Shortly after, a very short fortissimo bridge, played by the horns, takes place before a second theme is introduced. This second theme is in E-flat major, the relative major, and it is more lyrical, written piano and featuring the four-note motif in the string accompaniment. The codetta is again based on the four-note motif. The development section follows, including the bridge. During the recapitulation, there is a brief solo passage for oboe in quasi-improvisatory style, and the movement ends with a massive coda. Second movement, Andante con moto, the second movement, in A-flat major, is a lyrical work in double variation form, which means the two themes are presented and varied in alternation. Following the variations there is a long coda. The movement opens with an announcement of its theme, a melody in unison by violas and cellos, with accompaniment by the double basses. A second theme soon follows, with a harmony provided by clarinets, bassoons, and violins, with a triplet arpeggio in the violas and bass. A variation of the first theme reasserts itself. This is followed up by a third theme, 30-second notes in the violas and cellos with a counterphrase running in the flute, oboe, and bassoon. Following an interlude, the whole orchestra participates in a fortissimo, leading to a series of crescendos and a coda to close the movement. Third movement, scherzo. Allegro, the third movement is in ternary form, consisting of a scherzo and trio. It follows the traditional mold of classical-era symphonic third movements, containing in sequence the main scherzo, a contrasting trio section, a return of the scherzo, and a coda. However, while the usual classical symphonies employed a minuet and trio as their third movement, Beethoven chose to use the newest scherzo and trio form. The movement returns to the opening key of C minor and begins with the following theme, played by the cellos and double basses. The opening theme is answered by a contrasting theme played by the winds, and this sequence is repeated. Then the horns loudly announce the main theme of the movement, and the music proceeds from there. The trio section is in C major and is written in a contrapuntal texture. When the scherzo returns for the final time, it is performed by the strings pizzicato and very quietly. The scherzo offers contrasts that are somewhat similar to those of the slow movement in that they derive from extreme difference in character between scherzo and trio. The scherzo then contrasts this figure with the famous motto from the first movement, which gradually takes command of the whole movement. Fourth movement, Allegro, the triumphant and exhilarating finale begins without interruption after the scherzo. It is written in an unusual variant of sonata form. At the end of the development section, the music halts on a dominant cadence, played fortissimo, and the music continues after a pause with a quiet reprise of the horn theme of the scherzo movement. The recapitulation is then introduced by a crescendo coming out of the last bars of the interpolated scherzo section, just as the same music was introduced at the opening of the movement. The interruption of the finale with material from the third dance movement was pioneered by Haydn, who had done the same in his Symphony No. 46 in B, from 1772. It is not known whether Beethoven was familiar with this work. The Fifth Symphony finale includes a very long coda, in which the main themes of the movement are played in temporally compressed form. Towards the end the tempo is increased to presto. The symphony ends with 29 bars of C major chords, played fortissimo. In the classical style, Charles Rosen suggests that this ending reflects Beethoven's sense of classical proportions. The unbelievably long pure C major cadence is needed to ground the extreme tension of this immense work. It was shown recently that this long chord sequence was a pattern that Beethoven borrowed from the Italian composer Luigi Cherubini, whom Beethoven esteemed the most among his contemporary musicians. Spending much of his life in France, Cherubini employed this pattern consistently to close his overtures, which Beethoven knew well. The ending of his famous symphony repeats almost note by note and pause by pause the conclusion of Cherubini's unregistered trademark S overture to his opera Eliza, composed in 1794 and presented in Vienna in 1803. Influences. The 19th-century musicologist Gustav Nottebohm first pointed out that the third movement's theme has the same sequence of intervals as the opening theme of the final movement of Mozart's famous Symphony No. 40 in G minor, K. 550. Here is Mozart's theme. While such resemblances sometimes occur by accident, this is unlikely to be so in the present case. Not Bochum discovered the resemblance when he examined a sketchbook used by Beethoven in composing the Fifth Symphony. Here, 29 measures of Mozart's finale appear, copied out by Beethoven. Much has been written about the Fifth Symphony in books, scholarly articles, and program notes for live and recorded performances. This section summarizes some themes that commonly appear in this material. Fate motif. The initial motif of the symphony has sometimes been credited with symbolic significance as a representation of fate knocking at the door. This idea comes from Beethoven's secretary and factotum Anton Schindler, who wrote, many years after Beethoven's death. The composer himself provided the key to these depths when one day, in this author's presence, he pointed to the beginning of the first movement and expressed in these words the fundamental idea of his work, thus fate knocks at the door. Schindler's testimony concerning any point of Beethoven's life is disparaged by experts. Moreover, it is often commented that Schindler offered a highly romanticized view of the composer. There is another tale concerning the same motif. The version given here is from Anthony Hopkins' description of the symphony. Carl Schnee claimed that the little pattern of notes had come to Beethoven from a Yellowhammer's song, heard as he walked in the Prater Park in Vienna. Hopkins further remarks that given the choice between a yellowhammer and fate at the door, the public has preferred the more dramatic myth, though Schnee's account is too unlikely to have been invented. In his omnibus television lecture series in 1954, Leonard Bernstein has likened the fate motif to the four-note coda common to classical symphonies. These notes would terminate the classical symphony as a musical coda, but for Beethoven they become a motif repeating throughout the work for a very different and dramatic effect, he says. Evaluations of these interpretations tend to be skeptical. The popular legend that Beethoven intended this grand exordium of the symphony to suggest fate knocking at the gate is apocryphal. Beethoven's pupil, Ferdinand Ries, was really author of this would-be poetic exegesis, which Beethoven received very sarcastically when Ries imparted it to him. Elizabeth Schwarm-Glessner remarks that Beethoven had been known to say nearly anything to relieve himself of questioning pests. This might be taken to impugn both tales. Beethoven's choice of key, the key of the Fifth Symphony, C minor, is commonly regarded as a special key for Beethoven, specifically a stormy, heroic tonality. Beethoven wrote a number of works in C minor whose character is broadly similar to that of the Fifth Symphony. Writer Charles Rosen says, Beethoven in C minor has come to symbolize his artistic character. In every case, it reveals Beethoven as hero. C minor does not show Beethoven at his most subtle, but it does give him to us in his most extroverted form, where he seems to be most impatient of any compromise. Repetition of the opening motif throughout the symphony. It is commonly asserted that the opening four-note rhythmic motif is repeated throughout the symphony, unifying it. It is a rhythmic pattern that makes its appearance in each of the other three movements and thus contributes to the overall unity of the symphony. A single motif that unifies the entire work. The key motif of the entire symphony. The rhythm of the famous opening figure recurs at crucial points in later movements. The New Grove Encyclopedia cautiously endorses this view, reporting that the famous opening motif is to be heard in almost every bar of the first movement and, allowing for modifications, in the other movements. There are several passages in the symphony that have led to this view. For instance, in the third movement the horns play the following solo in which the short-long pattern occurs repeatedly. In the second movement, an accompanying line plays a similar rhythm. In the finale, Doug Briscoe suggests that the motif may be heard in the piccolo part, presumably meaning the following passage. Later, in the coda of the finale, the bass instruments repeatedly play the following. On the other hand, some commentators are unimpressed with these resemblances and consider them to be accidental. Anthony Hopkins, discussing the theme in the scherzo, says no musician with an ounce of feeling could confuse the two rhythms, explaining that the scherzo rhythm begins on a strong musical beat whereas the first movement theme begins on a weak one. Donald Francis Tovey pours scorn on the idea that a rhythmic motif unifies the symphony. This profound discovery was supposed to reveal an unsuspected unity in the work, but it does not seem to have been carried far enough. Applied consistently, he continues, the same approach would lead to the conclusion that many other works by Beethoven are also unified with the symphony, as the motif appears in the Appassionata Piano Sonata, the Fourth Piano Concerto, and in the String Quartet, Op. 74. Tovey concludes, the simple truth is that Beethoven could not do without just such purely rhythmic figures at this stage of his art. To Tovey's objection can be added the prominence of the short-long rhythmic figure in earlier works by Beethoven's older classical contemporaries Haydn and Mozart. To give just two examples, it is found in Haydn's Miracle Symphony, No. 96, and in Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 25, K. 503. Such examples show that short-long rhythms were a regular part of the musical language of the composers of Beethoven's day. It seems likely that whether or not Beethoven deliberately, or unconsciously, wove a single rhythmic motif through the Fifth Symphony will remain eternally open to debate. Use of La Folia. Folia is a dance form with a distinctive rhythm and harmony, which was used by many composers from the Renaissance well into the 19th and even 20th century, often in the context of a theme and variations. It was used by Beethoven in his Fifth Symphony in the harmony midway through the slow movement. Although some recent sources mention that the fragment of the Folia theme in Beethoven's symphony was detected only in the 90s of the last century, Reid J. Hoyt analyzed some Folia aspects in the oeuvre of Beethoven already in 1982 in his letter to the editor, in the journal College Music Symposium 21, where he draws attention to the existence of complex archetypal patterns and their relationship. Trombones and piccolos. While it is commonly stated that the last movement of Beethoven's Fifth is the first time the trombone and the piccolo were used in a concert symphony, it is not true. The Swedish composer Joachim Nicholas Egert specified trombones for his symphony in E-flat major written in 1807, and examples of earlier symphonies with a part for piccolo abound, including Michael Haydn's Symphony No. 19 in C major, composed in August 1773. Textual questions. Third movement repeat. In the autograph score, the third movement contains a repeat mark. When the scherzo and trio sections have both been played through, the performers are directed to return to the very beginning and play these two sections again. Then comes a third rendering of the scherzo, this time notated differently for pizzicato strings and transitioning directly to the finale. Most modern printed editions of the score do not render this repeat mark. And indeed most performances of the symphony render the movement as ABA, in contrast to the ABABA of the autograph score. The repeat mark in the autograph is unlikely to be simply an error on the composer's part. The ABABA scheme for scherzi appears elsewhere in Beethoven, in the Bagatelle for solo piano, Op. 33, No. 7, and in the Fourth, Sixth, and Seventh Symphonies. However, it is possible that for the Fifth Symphony, Beethoven originally preferred ABABA, but changed his mind in the course of publication in favor of ABA. Since Beethoven's day, published editions of the symphony have always printed ABA. However, in 1978 an edition specifying ABABA was prepared by Peter Gar 1/4 LKE and published by Peters. In 1999, yet another edition by Jonathan Delmar was published by Bar Currency Reinreiter which advocates a return to ABA. In the accompanying book of commentary, Delmar defends in depth the view that ABA represents Beethoven's final intention. In other words, that conventional wisdom was right all along. In concert performances, ABA prevailed until fairly recent times. However, since the appearance of the Gar 1/4 LKE edition, conductors have felt more free to exercise their own choice. The conductor Caroline Brown, in notes to her recorded ABABA performance with the Hanover Band, writes, "Re-establishing the repeat certainly alters the structural emphasis normally apparent in the symphony. It makes the scherzo less of a transitional make-weight, and, by allowing the listener more time to become involved with the main thematic motif of the scherzo, the sideways step into the bridge passage leading to the finale seems all the more unexpected and extraordinary in its intensity." Performances with a baba seem to be particularly favored by conductors who specialize in authentic performance. These include Browne, as well as Christopher Hogwood, John Eliot Gardner, and Nikolaus Harnonort. Ababa performances on modern instruments have also been recorded by the New Philharmonia Orchestra under Pierre Boulez, the Tonehall Orchestra Zurich under David Zinman, and the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra under Claudio Abbado. Reassigning bassoon notes to the horns. In the first movement, the passage that introduces the second subject of the exposition is assigned by Beethoven as a solo to the pair of horns. At this location, the theme is played in the key of E-flat major. When the same theme is repeated later on in the recapitulation section, it is given in the key of C major. Anthony Hopkins wrote, "This presented a problem to Beethoven, for the horns, of his day, severely limited in the notes they could actually play before the invention of valves, were unable to play the phrase in the new key of C major at least not without stopping the bell with the hand and thus muffling the tone." Beethoven therefore had to give the theme to a pair of bassoons, who, high in their compass, were bound to seem a less than adequate substitute. In modern performances the heroic implications of the original thought are regarded as more worthy of preservation than the secondary matter of scoring. The phrase is invariably played by horns, to whose mechanical abilities it can now safely be trusted. In fact, even before Hopkins wrote this passage, some conductors had experimented with preserving Beethoven's original scoring for bassoons. This can be heard on many performances including those conducted by Caroline Browne mentioned in the preceding section as well as in a recent recording by Simon Rattle with the Vienna Philharmonic. Although horns capable of playing the passage in C major were developed not long after the premiere of the Fifth Symphony, it is not known whether Beethoven would have wanted to substitute modern horns, or keep the bassoons, in the crucial passage. There are strong arguments in favor of keeping the original scoring even when modern valve horns are available. The structure of the movement posits a programmatic alteration of light and darkness, represented by major and minor. Within this framework, the topically heroic transitional theme dispels the darkness of the minor first theme group and ushers in the major second theme group. However, in the development section, Beethoven systematically fragments and dismembers this heroic theme in bars 180–210. Thus he may have rescored its return in the recapitulation for a weaker sound to foreshadow the essential expositional closure in minor. Moreover, the horns used in the fourth movement are natural horns in C, which can easily play this passage. If the instruments were on stage, Beethoven could perhaps have written Mutter in C in the first movement, similar to his Mutter in F instruction in measure 412 of the first movement of Symphony No. 3. However, the horns are playing immediately prior to this, so such a change would be rendered difficult if not impossible due to lack of time. Editions. The edition by Jonathan Delmar mentioned above was published as follows: Ludwig van Beethoven. Symphonies 1 €9. Urtext. Kassel, Bar Currency Reinreiter, 1996 €2000, ISMN M006-50054-3. An inexpensive version of the score has been issued by Dover Publications. This is a 1989 reprint of an old edition. Reference. Adaptations. The Fifth has been adapted many times to other genres. Examples include, arranged for piano solo by Franz Liszt. Electric Light Orchestra's version of Roll Over Beethoven incorporates the motif and elements from the first movement into a classic rock and roll song by Chuck Berry, A Fifth of Beethoven, a 1977 disco adaptation by Walter Murphy. Murphy's disco adaptation was itself the basis for Robin Thicke's first commercial success, called When I Get You Alone in 2002. Fantasia 2000 features a shortened version of the first movement as its first segment. Notes and references. Further reading. External links, general discussion and reviews of recordings, brief structural analysis, analysis of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, the Symphony of Destiny on the All About Ludwig van Beethoven page, program notes for a performance by the National Symphony Orchestra, Washington, D.C. Project Gutenberg has two MIDI versions of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. e-text number 117 and e-text number 156, program notes for a performance and lecture by Jeffrey Klein and the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. Creative Commons MP3 recording, public domain music recording, sketch to the scherzo from Op. 67 Fifth Symphony from Eroica SKBK, unheard Beethoven website, original finale in C minor to Fifth Symphony Op. 67, Gardi 23, unheard Beethoven website, scores, Symphony No. 5, free scores at the International Music Score Library Project. Symphony No. 5 is available in PDF format created from Muse data. Mutopia Project has a piano reduction score of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, public domain sheet music both typeset and scanned on Cantorian.org, full score of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony from Indiana University.